Another make-or-break day for Britain's parliamentary democracy, only this time there's a new sheriff in town. Forget those happy-go-lucky Boris the buffoon caricatures that dismiss the seriousness of the new UK Prime Minister, as the Commons once again try to wrest control of the Brexit process. Gone is Theresa May, in her place a Tory leader who looked at his wafer-thin majority, his divided party, and opted to come out swinging. Will Johnson really crack the whip and force out Remainers like Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, thereby irrevocably turning the Conservatives into the party of leave? Will he make good on the threat of a snap election? Would it steal the thunder of hard Brexiters out trying to outflank him on the right? The leader of the opposition claims he relishes the prospect of a snap poll, but will Remainers rally behind a Jeremy Corbyn who's never put his heart into staying in the EU? With that October 31st deadline for crashing out of the European Union looming, we on this side of the channel are dying to know what happens next. Today in the France 24 debate, all or nothing for Boris Johnson. Joining us, John Henley, European Affairs editor, correspondent for The Guardian newspaper. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
All right, want to welcome back as well Jeremy Stubbs. He's the chair of the British Conservatives in Paris. Thanks for being with us. Former Tory James Clark is the deputy leader of the Renew Party, which is in favour of staying in the EU. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And also from London, Eleanor Penny, senior editor at Novara Media. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. It's only the second day, by the way, that Parliament's been in session since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, what with that big summer break. One that might be, who knows, long remembered. First, there was the former Justice Minister, Philip Lee, tendering his resignation from the Conservative Party. He's now crossed the aisle to the Liberal Democrats, officially robbing Johnson of a majority at all. But that didn't dent Johnson's verve as he faced the music of a particularly raucous chamber.
That this country still stands then. And the bell's shameful. It means running up. It means running up the white flag. And I want to make clear to everybody in this House, there are no circumstances in which I will ever accept anything like it. I will never surrender the control of our negotiations in the way the leader of the opposition is demanding. Mr. Speaker.
I condemn the rhetoric the Prime Minister used when he talked about a surrender bill. I hope he will reflect on his use of language. I really do hope he will reflect on his use of language. We're not surrendering because we're at war with Europe. They are surely our partners. If anything, it is a no-deal exit that would mean surrendering our industry, our jobs, surrendering our standards and protections in a trade deal with Donald Trump and the United States.
Jeremy Stubbs, what do you think of the language, the use of the word white flag of surrender?
Well, we know Boris Johnson, he likes the Churchillian mode, so I don't think it has anything more than a sort of florid literary angle to it. On the other hand,
it is the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of the beginning of World War II, which, as
yes,
both leaders
I think he likes to identify with that period and the sort of the Dunkirk spirit and all of that kind of thing. But the real war, as we know, the real war is going on there in Parliament, nowhere else, and that is where there is a war, I think.
A war? Those are strong words. Why is there a war? Explain.
Well, in Hobbes's terms, it's the war of all against all. I mean, there isn't a big enough majority, it seems, for anything positive. The only things that there are majorities for are things that are negative. People are constantly voting against things. Parliament can't make up its mind. It's rather ironic that recently people have been shouting for Parliament to be given back its power when most people in the first 6 months of this year or so were condemning Parliament because it couldn't make up its mind, because it wouldn't assume its responsibilities. I mean, we are, in a sense, I mean, in a way, I would say the idea of war is even a bit too rational. We're in a state of chaos.
You agree with that, John Henley? And that, well, listening to Jeremy Stubbs, the only way out of this isn't that motion they're going to vote on later for avoiding a no-deal Brexit, but rather just cutting to the chase and calling a snap general election.
Well, I think there's a number of obstacles to be cleared before that general election could actually happen, which we might touch on later. But I think the problem is that, it's by no means clear that a general election would actually solve the problem. The arithmetic in Parliament has to fundamentally shift. That's true. And, in a general election, that might be the hope of the people who want a general election, that, that it might produce a shift in the arithmetic. But the fundamental problems of Britain's relationship with the European Union and the intractability of the kind of basic Brexit problems, are not going to go away.
Not going to go away. Just remind for our viewers, what does it mean, this Conservative member of Parliament, Philip Lee, crossing the aisle and joining the Lib Dems on the day of this crucial first vote, if it does? Well,
it makes it more likely that he was already going to vote with what's now called the Rebel Alliance, which is, the vast majority of the Labour Party MPs, the Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, the Greens, who are basically united together now in their desire to stop or to rule out the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. Philip Lee was already always going to vote with them. But there is the problem, as Jeremy rightly said, is that this Parliament, there is no majority for anything. There is no majority for Theresa May's
So we should have a general election.
There's no majority for a no-deal Brexit. And, up until now, there's been no clear legally binding majority, against a no-deal Brexit.
So we should have a general election?
Well, if that would clear everything, if that would clear the situation up, but I'm not convinced it would.
James Clark, several questions. First of all, do you, on a day like this, regret having left the Conservatives? Would it be better to be having this fight from within, keeping the Conservative Party as a bigger tent than it's becoming?
Thanks for the question. Strictly speaking, I was never a member of the Conservatives. The Renew Party is formed from people formerly aligned with Conservatives, Labour and Liberal Democrats. But to answer your question, certainly the Conservatives have made terrible mistakes. They're shedding a lot of their best people. It's pretty clear now that the Conservative Party is not a home for the pragmatic, for the sensible, for the non-ideological. They've made a bed for themselves, and the leadership now, Captain Chaos and General Disarray, Johnson and Cummings, are looking very, very vulnerable.
You're saying they're in disarray. They seem to have a more forceful game plan than Johnson's predecessor.
I would disagree completely. I think they may have played their joker too early. What they've succeeded in this time is really galvanising the Remain side. And what you can see now is a Remain alliance being built by smaller parties like the Renew Party, with the Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid, SNP, and we're looking like a far more formidable and realistic force than the Conservatives and Brexit parties are as things stand this evening. And we'll see what happens at 10 p.m. Tonight with the vote.
And you heard John Henley express skepticism as to whether or not a snap general election would clear the air. Do you agree?
A general election this autumn would almost certainly be a proxy for a second referendum. If the Labour Party could be pushed to come out as an explicitly Remain party, I think it could clear the air. It's not entirely clear if they would, but if they did, they'd be very welcome in a Remain alliance. Otherwise, the absolutely key thing is to prevent Johnson and Cummings winning a majority and pushing through and inflicting a very, very harmful Brexit, which will be no good for British jobs or for the youth in this country.
All right, on Monday, the former Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, took aim at both Brexit and his successor as leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, warning of snap elections as a trap laid by the current occupant of number 10 Downing Street.
Boris Johnson knows that if no-deal Brexit stands on its own as a proposition, it might well fail. But if he mixes it up with the Brexit question and the Corbyn question together in a general election, he could succeed, despite a majority being against a no-deal Brexit, because some may fear a Corbyn premiership more.
And certainly there were elements of language that were unmistakable when Boris Johnson called out Corbyn over his past Euroscepticism.
Time and time again he has said that he's on the side of democracy and vindicating the will of the people. And what do we see now, Mr. Speaker? He has been converted. He has been converted with his hordes of momentum activists trying to take over the streets, converted into the agent of those who would subvert democracy and overturn the will of the people.
Eleanor Penny, I'm not sure you'd use the expression hordes of momentum activists, but is that an effective turn of phrase by Boris Johnson to get what he wants?
Well, I'm not sure I would use the phrase hordes, but certainly there were tens of thousands of people out on the streets across London and across the UK protesting the prorogation of Parliament. But those weren't just momentum activists. Some of them were, in fact, Leave voters, united in their complete outrage at what is clearly a power grab on behalf of a pretty cynical administration with very few cards left to play. And what's become very clear is that although there's been a lot made of Dominic Cummings as this conniving genius strategist, in reality, it's all PR. His strategy is all about trying to summon the image of Boris Johnson as a Churchillian, barnstorming leader, alone standing against the EU. But when it actually comes down to the detail of negotiations, there's very, very little wiggle room in terms of the EU being able to provide a kind of deal that would satisfy Johnson's base, and that would also prevent a lot of Conservative voters turning, for instance, to Lib Dems or not showing up in the case of a general election.
But hang on a second,
sheer force
Eleanor.
of Boris bluster is not going to change that.
Sheer force of Boris bluster, but here, Boris Johnson, he knows that Jeremy Corbyn for the Remain camp is deeply unpopular, and that if he's the one who's going to sort of lead the coalition to keep Britain from crashing out without a no deal, that he's going to be treading on thin ice.
That's interesting because the Labour Party is the biggest political party in Europe, and many tens of thousands of people joined specifically because Jeremy Corbyn is leader of the party, and a lot of them were out on the streets in the 2017 election, and that foot presence was probably something that had a lot to do with swinging the vote in their direction and depriving the Conservatives of their majority. However, I am in the strange position of agreeing with Tony Blair in his analysis that Boris Johnson clearly wants to muddle up the question of no deal and Brexit per se to try and grant himself a mandate for his particular style of Brexit, which involves, flogging off large swathes of British industry to the US. And so I think that's where it's very important that parliamentarians in the next few hours, in the next few days, exercise their rights in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2015 to apply conditions to any election that's called. And the conditions would need to be taking no deal off the table, and also mandating Boris to go back and ask for an extension, probably it looks like until the 31st of January, because we can't have detailed conversations about the future of this country with the question of no deal hanging over us, because it is just such a catastrophic threat that all detail is lost to this kind of hysterical atmosphere.
James Clark, let me just ask you, if there was this turn of events that made it where Boris Johnson was disavowed by Parliament, overrun by both houses, including the Lords, and that we'd need a caretaker prime minister in the UK. Would you go along with Jeremy Corbyn as the man to take the UK to new elections?
It's a matter of sequencing. First we have to take no deal off the table. Second, we have to ensure that a general election is not called on the terms that Johnson and Cummings are after. If we manage that, I believe a vote of no confidence and a government of national unity would be a desirable outcome. Personally, I could cope with that, with Corbyn as leader, as long as it was temporary and it was for a very specific goal of extending or revoking Article 50 altogether with a view to another referendum.
We're going to talk more about that sequencing after the break, but every one of those bits of that sequencing have to go right for Remainers. The cards are in Boris Johnson's favour at this point, Jeremy Stubbs?
Well, the sequence has to go right for both camps, as it were, and that is the uncertainty we're in. Boris Johnson, if he has his hands tied by legislation by tomorrow, then his best way out of his situation is an election. Now, he has to rely on Parliament to agree to that election, and the worst sequencing for him would be to lose his legislative abilities to negotiate and then be forced to remain as an impotent prime minister until whenever the next election were to come along. So there's an awful lot. Everybody is playing their highest cards at the moment this week. I don't want to be dramatic, but that's how things are.
John Henley, I don't think we've overbilled it, but this is make or break.
It is it's a hugely significant week. It's probably, the most significant week in British politics in at least the last several decades.
And we said that several months ago.
Well, it could seem, but no, this one really could be. I mean, it is likely. This week is likely to determine, how and if. Britain leaves the European Union. It may well trigger a general election. It may well lead in the much longer term to a really serious look at the British Constitution, which has quite clearly been shown to be lacking over the last few days. It's going to almost certainly lead to the end of the careers of a fairly large number of quite eminent British politicians. I mean, it's a massive week.
How will the two major parties look after next week? We'll be asking our panel when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking ahead to the first big test for Boris Johnson, who's decided to go for broke, first by proroguing the amount of time that Parliament sits between now and the October 31st deadline for leaving the European Union, and now who faces the reaction of Remainers who are trying to force no deal off the table, a first motion to be voted on before a second one, if that passes, on Wednesday. With us, John Henley, European Affairs correspondent from The Guardian newspaper, Jeremy Stubbs, who is the chair of British Conservatives in Paris, James Clark, who is deputy leader of the Renew Party and who joins us from London, as does Eleanor Penny, senior editor at Novara Media. Earlier, there was, before this stormy session of Parliament, Boris Johnson, who had first the previous night marshalled his cabinet, and this morning meeting with backbench Remainers. He seems to have failed to win them over, backbench Remainers within the Conservative Party, this after threatening them with basically being expelled if there was a snap election, if they seem to be remaining resolute at this point, pointing to the numerous times that Boris Johnson voted against Theresa May and pointing their ire at his chief strategist.
It's a sign, I'm afraid, that the party of which I've been a member now for 47 years is going off the rails very, very quickly and appears to be run by somebody who isn't even a member of the Conservative Party, working out of Downing Street called Mr. Dominic Cummings.
Yes, Dominic Cummings, if you don't know him, the man who ran the Vote Leave campaign with the slogan, Take Back Control. Strong words from Dominic Grieve there, Jeremy Stubbs, saying that the party's being run off the rails by someone who's not even a member of the Conservatives. Do you agree?
Well, one can always attribute this kind of influence to advisors behind the scenes, but Dominic Cummings wouldn't be there if Boris Johnson didn't want him there. And if there is any fault or indeed any credit to be given, it's going to be Boris Johnson's. I don't think that there's an attempt to demonise Dominic Cummings, as we heard earlier on, as some kind of master strategist, some kind of Machiavellian guru. He's just another political advisor.
Jeremy, but during the Brexit campaign, you were a Remainer. You remember that big red bus that had that promise to all the money that would go back to the National Health Service? That's Dominic Cummings.
It is indeed, and you can see that exactly. But you can see that he's really a campaign manager, not really, I think, a political strategist. And we shouldn't therefore inflate him into something much more than he really is. I say again, if we want to give credit or blame, then it's really the Prime Minister who we should be talking about, not really Dominic Cummings.
Do you have a problem with Boris Johnson having Dominic Cummings in his employ?
No, after all, none of us knows what is actually being whispered between them, and it's difficult for us to judge, just as it was difficult for us to judge what was whispered between Theresa May and her two advisors, Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill. These are always things that are pretty well off the screen, off the radar, until a long time afterwards, perhaps. I don't think we should be worrying about Dominic Cummings. I think we should be worrying about Parliament and what is being said there. Dominic Cummings, he wouldn't even be where he is now if Parliament had reached some sort of decision earlier on.
He's even become famous here in France because they've shown that docu-fiction about Brexit starring Benedict Cumberbatch. John Henley, you agree with Jeremy?
Yes, I do, actually. I think that that Cummings is clearly a brilliant campaigner and a campaign manager, but I don't think he knows Parliament, and I don't think he's a political strategist. And I think the proof of that is emerging this week. I think he has put Cummings, if Cummings has put Boris Johnson, in a very, very difficult position, and it is absolutely not clear how Johnson is going to get out of it. I mean, I think, Cummings's calculation was clearly, I think, that the only way of delivering Brexit was a no-deal Brexit, and hence the strategy clearly is, as seems to have been emerging today from various leaks which seem to be quite reliable, and from various sources, essentially suggesting that the strategy is to run the clock down. That talk of progress in negotiations with the EU, which they have repeatedly denied today. Again, several sources in the European Union have denied that there's been any progress at all in these so-called negotiations. So to run the clock down, to basically demand of the EU 27 something which they know is impossible and will be impossible for the EU 27 to give, namely cutting the famous backstop.
But at least bring closure. And we've heard the French president himself say he's fed up with this thing going on forever.
Everybody is fed up. But the point is, which everybody's, this is the thing that I really can't understand, is that no deal is not closure. No deal will absolutely not be closure. No deal will be the start of 10 years, completely fraught and complicated and absurd negotiations. Britain will become like Switzerland in permanent negotiation with the European Union. And it will be doing so from a position of great weakness, with shortages of medicines, of foodstuffs, with British businesses going bankrupt. I mean, no deal is really, there should be absolutely no misunderstanding about this. No deal would be a disaster, and it is not the end of anything. It's the start of something far worse.
All right, James Clark, Boris Johnson, is he just simply realizing that, well, the stars have realigned politically? The two traditional parties can't go on the way they have been in the UK, much as we've seen the support erode for the two biggest traditional center-left and center-right parties in Germany. And here in France, those parties get, in fact, obliterated by the centrist formation of Emmanuel Macron. well, trying to take the lead before that happens and saying, yeah, let's just change the Conservative Party?
I think you make a good point. What's clear from the recent weeks, months, and years of UK politics is that the old parties are not fit for purpose. They brought us to crisis. That's why we started Renew, because it's obvious the system is not working, and we need complete renewal and reform. Now, whether the first step to that of the Conservatives is becoming blue kip, veering wildly to the right and appealing only to the most hysterical wing of their parliamentary party and their voters, I don't know. If it is, I don't think it's a good idea. Is there a space for new parties like the Renew Party to come in and reform the system? Absolutely. I don't want Brexit to hurt the UK. I'd like it to be halted, stopped, or arrested in some other sense. But it's obvious that there's a space for something new.
A space for something new? Or Eleanor Penny, do these old parties still have life left in them?
Well, the big joke is that the Brexit referendum was initially called in order to essentially quell a small dispute on what was then the Conservative backbenches, and look at where we are now. The Conservative Party is essentially tearing itself apart because on one hand you have the prospect of not delivering a no-deal Brexit or something pretty close to it, and then you cede a lot of ground to the real hardliners, which hold an enormous amount of sway both in the party and in politics more generally, or you push on with no deal and you assume responsibility for a huge and devastating economic shock, which, as has been said before, involves some totally cannibalistic trade deals with the US and complete disaster for the lives of many millions of people in this country.
But we're seeing kind of similar. Are we seeing similar dynamics within the Labour Party, where you have most members of Parliament who strongly disagree on many points with Jeremy Corbyn?
I think the existential crisis at the heart of the Conservative Party at the moment is of a different character to the factional disputes within the Labour Party, although those can't be played down. The parliamentary Labour Party is very much at odds with the membership, who are much more radical than them on many issues. And I think this really gets to the heart of the question, which is the idea that Boris Johnson comes out yesterday evening and says, I don't want a general election, you don't want a general election. Well, for a lot of people, that's simply not the case, because the idea that this election would be a proxy referendum on Brexit is not set in stone at all. And really, this is an opportunity to ask and have a conversation about much broader issues in politics, which have been going on not just for the past months, not just for the past 3 years since the referendum, but for the past 9 years.
But what does it tell you, the fact that it's so fractious? What does it tell you that it's so fractious within both of these traditional? This is supposed to be, an oppositional system you have in the UK with the Conservatives on one side, the Labour on the other, and there's so much infighting in both. I don't think that it's useful to draw a one-to-one comparison, because you're absolutely right. There have been there's been a lot of infighting, and the kind of traditional assumed loyalties of each of these parties have really been tested by the questions of Brexit, because the question of in or out, leave or remain, are hugely simple, and the detail of what those futures would look like hugely vary within themselves and are hugely dependent on what you ask and obscure vast political differences. And this is why just campaigning on the basis of Remain, going back to 2016, is going to be wildly insufficient to win a second Brexit referendum, because that would be replaying the same mistakes of the 2016 referendum, which is to say we should stay in because everything needs to remain the same and
Politics needs to be
Right, so
just left to get on with it, and we're richer within the European Union. When for many people facing down by then, 6 years of austerity, that simply wasn't the case.
All right, it won't be as simple as a yes/no question on a referendum. We've just gotten breaking news that the Speaker of the UK Parliament, John Henley, John Bercow, says there is support for the emergency debate, so there is going to be the motion. He's turned into a bit of a cult hero. The French are starting to pay attention to John Bercow because of the theatrics, I suppose, of that bicameral, that chamber, the way it is.
Well, he is an immensely colourful character.
How big a player is he over the next week?
Well,
you mentioned how crucial a week it is.
Well, I think the most crucial decision is the one that he's just taken to allow this debate this evening, which will effectively determine whether or not what's called the Ben Bill, which is the bill that will ultimately, if the Remain alliance or if the Rebel alliance succeeds, this bill will become law and will oblige the government to ask for an extension from the European Union if a no-deal Brexit is the only option available on, I think, the 19th of October, is that right? So, yeah, I mean, he's a hugely important figure. But as you said, this, and I think this is where James is right as well. I think that one thing that Brexit has revealed, and is very, is quite an alarming feature of British politics, I think, is the complete incapacity of the British political system, this bicameral system, as you say, where in France where you have the hemicycle, in Britain it's kind of a bear pit. You just have these two sides face to face with each other, and no compromise is possible. There has been since the start of the referendum, there's been no serious effort or no serious belief that collaboration and compromise and cooperation is possible across both sides of the House of Commons, and that's why we are. But that's why Brexit.
Yeah, you have a first past the post system for these elections.
Brexit has become a party political issue rather than an issue about the future of the country, and that is a very serious problem.
A very serious problem on that score, James Clark. At this point in time, are you privy to any cross-party talks, cross-party strategy, or is it to each his own?
Yeah, I mean, when we're on the doors, when we're fighting by-elections, what we're finding out is that people understand that we can't have an eternity of red versus blue. We can't vote red to keep the blues out and blues to keep the reds out forever. And the idea that the solutions to the problems that have been caused by these parties lie within the ranks of Labour and Conservative is becoming less and less credible. On the topic of cooperation of parties, you may have been aware that in Boris Johnson's own seat in Uxbridge and Ruislip, we have the beginnings of a Remain alliance there. Renew will be standing with the Liberal Democrat candidate. This happened in Brecon and Radnorshire, where other smaller parties, such as the Renew Party, stepped down. This is happening everywhere. The seeds of renewal and reform are there. We just hope that the UK is not in too much of a damaged state by the time the rest of the Remain parties get our acts together and do our best to oppose what's looking like, potentially a very damaging government under Boris Johnson.
You talk about damage. Markets are starting to be spooked by the prospect of a no deal. What with the British pound earlier falling to its lowest level versus the US dollar since 2016 and the immediate aftermath of the Brexit referendum. Should investors be afraid, Jeremy?
Well, investors, they have their own animal spirits, as John Maynard Keynes said. But I have to say I disagree with much of the analysis we've heard about the parties there, because in some ways it's much simpler. We've got a two-party system and we've got a two-answer question. And the trouble is that if, in fact, the voters, and it's the voters who have been calling the shots ultimately, You know, they voted for these parties. They voted in that referendum. The voters are split between Leave and Remain. If they were split along party lines, it would be easy. But both the parties' main electorates are themselves split. I love to see what is going to be said by Labour voters who voted Leave when they hear that their party will now probably be aligning with Remain. They will be having the same problems that the Conservatives have been having with the very considerable body of people who voted and who want Leave.
And to someone like the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, who, he's being threatened with expulsion, basically, by the Conservative Party, a party he's been a member of, he says, for more than 4 decades.
Well, we've come to a shocking pass. We've come to a shocking pass when that happens. But it has to be said, it hasn't happened yet. We're still, as it were, on day 1 or day 2 of the week of drama. We'll have to see whether that actually takes place.
That so-called whipping threat by the Prime Minister, it's an empty one?
Not necessarily. I mean, many MPs have had the whip withdrawn in the past. We often speak about these things that are happening today as though they had never happened in the past. They have happened before. It's just that we've never had so many of these things happening at the same time in such a fraught set of circumstances.
I mean, it's not only is it possibly and very probably an empty threat. It actually seems to have been quite counterproductive in that it seems to have sort of stiffened the resolve of those Conservative rebels who have been so disgusted by the threat. That they've become even more determined to vote in favour of the bill tomorrow.
John Henley, European Affairs Editor of The Guardian. What does the rest of Europe do? We saw, remarks today by the Irish Prime Minister saying we're sticking to, of course, the backstop agreement in his case. We've heard remarks in the last few days from places like Germany saying, well, we haven't heard any concrete proposals yet. Beyond that, what does the EU do?
Well, I mean, I think what the EU will do is stick exactly where it has stuck for the last 3 years, which is the idea that, yes, there can be small compromises, small concessions, but that ultimately the integrity of the single market, which is what has been behind, it really is the bedrock of the EU's success over the last several decades. The integrity of that single market must at all costs be preserved, and it is more important to the member states of the European Union to preserve that than it is to look after the interests of a country that is departing, even if that country is a substantial partner. And I think there's another trade partner. There's another point worth mentioning, and that's often forgotten, which is that the EU is majoritarily a union of relatively small countries. Everybody always talks about the Franco-German motor, and Italy is, of course, a large economy as well. But the vast majority of European member states are relatively small countries who would be pretty weak on the world stage were they not members of the European Union. And there is absolutely no way that the EU 27 will throw another small country, namely Ireland, under the bus for the sake of a larger country that has decided to leave.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. That that emergency debate taking place in the UK Parliament as we speak. I want to thank you, John Henley. I want to thank Jeremy Stubbs, James Clark, and Eleanor Penny for being with us from London. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
And no shortage of suspense.
No, absolutely. Everyone talking about this one. And it's not just in the UK, of course, it is across Europe. Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of the big German newspapers, had the headline simply, Boris is lying. A French take on this, which I particularly like, comes from L'Opinion, the cartoonist CAC, who has Boris Johnson portrayed as one of the Sex Pistols wearing his T-shirt Anarchy in the UK. It's the detail for me in this cartoon, though, that I particularly love. The skull and crossbones has EU written on it. The badges have I'm a mess and the harder the better, talking, of course, about the kind of Brexit that he wants to see the UK exit the EU with. Looking elsewhere, though, if we're looking for more punk attitudes, well, I think Philip Lee was the one who rocked the establishment today, an MP that you might not be that familiar with already, but he has talked about not being happy with the way Brexit's being handled, and midway through Boris Johnson's speech today, he actually crossed the floor and went and sat down with the Liberal Democrats. As this person says, he's a writer for the Independent newspaper, if that's a defection, it's been done in full WWE style, that sort of mad wrestling sort of programme.
Plenty of theatrics.
Absolutely. And it is theatrical. It does, when you see the actual act itself, it doesn't look all that dramatic. It's just some people mooching slowly towards a different seat. But this is a huge deal. And the fact that he chose to do it in the middle of Boris Johnson's speech, which did seem to slightly throw him off balance. He wasn't expecting it to happen, certainly not at that particular moment in time.
And further to John Henley's point, again, you see this is the makeup of the House of Commons. It's not the semicircle that we have here in France, and it's just begging for this kind of theatrics.
Absolutely, very much so. A lot of people were really quite taken aback by the way in which this happened. He clearly was trying to maximise the drama and the impact of his decision to quit the party that he's been with for 27 years. There are two tweets here that really encapsulate the way that the UK is split right now. The moment an anti-Democrat spat in the faces of the British people, says this person who's clearly very much pro-Brexit. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have this delicious, one of those moments where you will always remember what you were doing when this happened.
Okay.
And that really is as polarised as it is. People either are disgusted or delighted, and there is no middle ground. People don't seem to really want to know what the reasons are. They just want to know whether or not that person's in their camp. Welcome on board, say the Liberal Democrats. Philip Lee has written on their website a piece talking about why he felt it was necessary to do it. And it's very strongly worded. He says, this Conservative government is aggressively pursuing a damaging Brexit in unprincipled ways. He goes on to say that he believes it's putting lives and livelihoods at risk unnecessarily, and it's wantonly endangering the integrity of the United Kingdom. Now, talking about putting lives and livelihoods in danger, this is huge. And a lot of the time, with all the sort of nitpicking and the silly little arguments about Brexit, the really big picture gets a bit lost in translation. There are plenty of rebels talking about voting against the government, basically saying that they want to stop a no deal from happening. Nicholas Soames is a real Tory grandee. The MP for Mid Sussex has been for many years. He says he will vote against the government tonight. Boris Johnson has threatened to deselect those who do that. And what a lot of people are pointing out is the fact that Nicholas Soames is the grandson of Winston Churchill. Boris Johnson is very, very admirative of
Wrote a biography.
Churchill. Absolutely, he's his biographer. So it will be quite something, as Charlie Proctor from Monarchy UK points out. It will be quite something to expel the grandson of Sir Winston Churchill from the Conservative Party on what is the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II. So plenty of symbolism about that. Mr. Soames himself has replied with this, one of his trademark lengthy hashtags, oh, shut up and try to do your job properly. That is directed at Boris Johnson. So we will wait and see how many other people take the same stance.
Is this trending, by the way?
No, not yet.
All right, okay.
Usually people can't work out what he said because he doesn't put any capitals in there.
All right, many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.